The auctioneer's voice cut through the desert heat like a blade, and Delia Hurst stood on a wooden platform in the middle of a town she had never heard of, wearing a dress that was not hers, blinking against a sun that felt like judgment. She had not planned to be here. That was perhaps the most important thing to understand about Delia Hurst. Nothing in her life had ever gone according to any plan she had made. And this particular morning in the autumn of 1878, in the sun-scorched town of Calico Flats, Nevada, was no exception to that long and painful rule. 3 weeks earlier, she had been in Sacramento, California, working as a seamstress in a shop owned by a pinch-faced woman named Mrs. Aldridge, who paid her barely enough to keep bread on her small table and coal in her iron stove. Delia had been 24 years old, unmarried, and increasingly aware that the world did not particularly care what happened to unmarried women of limited means who had no fathers, no brothers, and no husbands to speak for them. She had been saving what little she could, penny by careful penny, dreaming of something better without being entirely sure what better looked like. Then a man named Harlan Croft had come into Mrs. Aldridge's shop one Tuesday afternoon, well-dressed and smooth-talking, with a smile that Delia had mistaken for kindness. He had introduced himself as an agent for a respectable household in the Nevada territory, seeking a housekeeper and seamstress of good reputation. He had offered her a wage that was double what Mrs. Aldridge paid, plus room and board. He had produced what looked like a letter of reference from a family named Whitmore of Carson City, and he had seemed entirely trustworthy in the way that only the very worst people can seem. She had packed her one good trunk, said goodbye to the narrow room above the seamstress shop, and climbed into the stage wagon Harlan Croft had arranged. She had not told anyone where she was going because there was no one to tell. That loneliness, which she had carried so long it had become something like a companion, was the thing that made her vulnerable. Harlan Croft had seen it in her eyes before she had even spoken her first word to him. 2 days into the journey, the stage wagon had veered south instead of east, and when Delia had asked one of the two rough men riding alongside why they were not heading toward Carson City, the man had looked at her with an expression that made her stomach turn cold. The letter from the Whitmore family had been forged. The household position had never existed. Harlan Croft was a man who moved women between places the way other men moved cattle, and he was very good at his work. By the time the wagon pulled into Calico Flats on a Thursday morning, Delia understood exactly what was happening to her, and the understanding sat in her chest like a stone. Calico Flats was a mining town that had grown too fast for anyone to maintain any sense of order within it. Silver had been pulled from the hills east of the town for the better part of a decade, and with the silver had come the particular species of men who follow silver: rough men, ambitious men, men who had left their better natures somewhere along the trail and never thought to go back for them. There was a main street with a saloon, a general store, a barber, a land office, a sheriff's office that appeared largely decorative, and a series of wooden structures that leaned against each other like drunken companions. Dust moved through the air like it owned the place. The auction, Delia would learn, was not an uncommon practice in places like Calico Flats in 1878, though it was no less shameful for being common. When the labor supply was short and men far outnumbered women, certain unscrupulous individuals had developed a profitable trade in what they called arrangement auctions, a polished phrase for something deeply ugly. Women, usually those who had been deceived or displaced or simply run out of options, were presented before assembled buyers as prospective wives or household workers, depending on whatever story the seller chose to tell. The sheriff in Calico Flats had long since been purchased by the men who ran the trade, and the law provided no protection. There were 6 women on the platform when Delia was pushed up to join them. She did not know any of them. Some looked frightened. One looked hollowed out, as though she had already been frightened so many times that fear had simply worn through and left an empty space behind. Delia looked at all of them and felt something steady form in the center of her chest. Not courage exactly, but a determination not to become hollow. The auctioneer, a fat man in a brown coat whose name was Jessup Webb, moved along the line of women with the cheerful efficiency of a man selling corn at a county fair. He described each woman the way you might describe a horse: her approximate age, her apparent health, her usefulness for various kinds of work. When he reached Delia, he gripped her arm to turn her toward the assembled crowd of perhaps 30 men, and she felt every nerve in her body revolt against his touch. "This one is young and strong," Jessup Webb said. "Good with a needle, I'm told. Healthy constitution. Gentlemen, what do we say for a starting bid?" Delia stared out at the crowd. Most of the men were looking at her with expressions that ranged from casual interest to something she did not want to name. The sun was directly in her eyes, and she could not see individual faces clearly, only shapes and shadows. Dust swirled around the base of the platform. Somewhere nearby, a horse was shifting its weight and tapping one hoof against dry ground, and for a strange floating moment that sound was the only thing that seemed real to Delia in a world that had become entirely unreal. Bids were called. Numbers rose. She heard her own price climbing the way you might hear the price of something at a market, disconnected from yourself, observing from a distance. She thought briefly of her mother, who had died of fever when Delia was 11, and of her father, who had walked out of their small house in Missouri 6 months after that and never walked back in. She thought about the trunk she had packed in Sacramento, which Harlan Croft had kept, and the few personal items inside it: a silver comb that had been her mother's, a small Bible with pressed flowers between its pages, 3 letters she had written and never sent to a friend who had moved to Oregon. A voice called out from somewhere at the back of the crowd, and it was different from the other voices. Not louder, not more aggressive. Just different in a way that cut through the heat and the noise and the awful normality of what was happening. "Before we go any further," the voice said. "What's her name?" the crowd murmured. Jessup Webb paused in his auctioneer's rhythm and looked toward the back of the crowd with an expression of mild irritation, the way a man looks when someone asks a question at the wrong time. "What's her name?" the voice said again, and this time it was firmer. Delia shaded her eyes against the sun. At the back of the assembled men, leaning against a post at the edge of the crowd, was a man she could not fully make out. He was tall, wearing a dark hat and a light canvas coat, and he stood with the particular stillness of someone who had decided something. "What does it matter what her name is?" Jessup Webb called back, laughing in the way men laugh when they want something to sound reasonable that is not reasonable at all. "It matters to me," the voice said. The crowd shifted. Something in the tone had changed the temperature of the air. Jessup Webb wiped his forehead with a cloth and looked uncomfortable for just a moment before reassembling his practiced smile. "Well, I don't rightly know her name," he admitted. Delia found her own voice then, and it surprised her because she had not been sure it would come when she called for it. "My name," she said clearly, loudly enough for the whole crowd to hear, "is Delia Hurst, and I am not for sale." The silence that followed was brief but total. Then the man at the back of the crowd pushed through to the front, and Delia got her first clear look at George Stone. He was perhaps 28 or 29 years old, with a face that had been weathered by the outdoors into something honest and angular. His eyes were dark brown, and they were fixed on the auctioneer with a steadiness that spoke of a man who was not easily moved from his course. He was not the largest man in the crowd, nor the most obviously armed, though he wore a pistol at his hip the way most men in Calico Flats did, as a matter of basic practicality. What set him apart was something harder to name, a quality of deliberateness, as though every movement he made had been considered before he made it. He stopped at the base of the platform and looked up at Delia. Not at her the way the other men had been looking at her, as though she were a thing to be evaluated, but at her the way one person looks at another, seeing a person, not an object. "Miss Hurst," he said, My name is George Stone. I have a cattle ranch about 14 miles north of here. I am looking for a housekeeper, and I will pay a fair wage for honest work, and I would like to discuss the matter with you directly rather than through Mr. Webb." He paused, and then added, with a quietness that somehow reached her more clearly than any of the shouting had, "If that suits you." Jessup Webb stepped forward. "Now see here, the bidding is not concluded." "I believe it is," George Stone said, and he turned to look at Jessup Webb with an expression that was not angry exactly, but that contained within it the clear and calm suggestion that arguing the point would not go well for Jessup Webb. Delia stepped down from the platform. No one stopped her. She was not entirely sure why no one stopped her, except that George Stone had placed himself at the base of the steps in a way that made stopping her a thing that would require passing through him first. And looking at him, most of the assembled men seemed to calculate quickly that this was not worth attempting. Jessup Webb sputtered. Harlan Croft was nowhere to be seen. She would learn later that he had collected his payment from Webb and left town before the auction even started, which was how he always worked. Delia stepped down onto the dusty street of Calico Flats and stood beside George Stone and felt, for the first time in 3 weeks, that she was standing on solid ground. "I want to be clear about something," she said to him immediately, because clarity seemed very important in that moment. "I am not a purchased woman. I am not beholden to anyone." "I know that," George Stone said simply. "I asked your name. I did not bid on you." She studied him. He met her gaze without flinching or faltering, and she found nothing in his expression except a plain, unadorned sincerity that was so uncommon in her recent experience that she did not quite know what to do with it. "You said you have a ranch," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "You said you would pay fair wages." "I did." "What constitutes fair wages in your estimation?" A very slight shift at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but close to one. "What do you consider fair, Miss Hurst? You set the terms." She had not expected that. In her experience, men did not ask women to set terms. She straightened her spine, which was already quite straight. $20 a month plus room and board with Sundays free. Written agreement, not just a spoken one. $20 and Sundays free, he repeated, as though confirming the terms with himself. "That is fair. I accept." Around them, the rest of the crowd was dispersing in the way crowds disperse when the thing they came to see has been disrupted into something uninteresting. Jessup Webb was arguing with someone in a raised voice about refunded payment. The sun was still merciless and the dust was still everywhere, and Delia Hurst was standing in the middle of a street in a town she had never heard of, having just negotiated employment with a stranger who had been the only person in a crowd of 30 to ask her name. "Where is your horse?" she asked. "Tied up at the livery," he said. "My wagon is there too. I came to town for supplies." "Then we should collect your supplies and your wagon and leave this town," Delia said, "as soon as possible." "I was thinking the same thing," George Stone said. They walked to the livery together, side by side but not touching, maintaining the careful distance of two people who do not yet know each other, but are trying to take the measure of the situation. At the livery, George Stone's wagon was a solid, practical thing. A farm wagon with good wheels and a bay horse named Marshall who had kind eyes and flicked his ears at Delia when she held out her hand to him. George loaded the supplies he had purchased from the general store: flour, salt, coffee, lamp oil, a coil of new rope, some hardware items she could not identify with efficient movements, and without asking for her help. Though when she offered it, he accepted it without any of the surprised condescension that men sometimes showed when women offered to do useful things. As they pulled out of Calico Flats, moving north along a trail that was more dirt suggestion than actual road, the town fell away behind them, and the Nevada desert opened up in every direction, vast and bronze and ancient under the October sky. The sun had begun to descend from its highest point, casting longer shadows from the scrubby brush and the occasional Joshua tree, and the air was beginning to carry the first edge of the cold that came quickly in desert country once the sun lost its height. They did not speak for a while. The wagon moved steadily, and the horses' hooves made a rhythm on the hard ground, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who both understood that the morning had been extraordinary, and that ordinary conversation seemed insufficient to follow it. "How did you come to be on that platform?" George Stone asked finally. His voice was not intrusive with the question. He asked it the way you might ask about the weather, gently, leaving room for her to answer as much or as little as she chose. She told him the story. All of it: Mrs. Aldridge and the seamstress shop, Harlan Croft and the forged letter, the wagon that had veered south. She told it plainly, without self-pity and without embellishment, because those were not things she had much patience for. When she was finished, George Stone was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry that happened to you," he said. There was no performance in it, no theatrical sympathy. It was simply a true statement made by someone who meant it. "I intend to make sure it does not happen again," Delia said. "How do you intend to do that?" "By being more careful about who I trust," she said, "and by ensuring that I am always in a position where I have something of my own savings, skills, a means of independence. I will not be made vulnerable through poverty again if I can help it." George Stone considered this for a long moment. The wagon rolled on. A hawk circled somewhere above them in wide, patient arcs. "That seems very wise," he said, and he said it with a straightforwardness that suggested he was not simply being agreeable, but had actually considered her statement and found it sound. She looked at him sideways. He was watching the trail ahead, guiding Marshall with easy, practiced hands. His jaw was set in a comfortable line, and there were fine lines at the corners of his eyes that came from years of squinting against this same desert sun. She put his age at 28, perhaps 29, not so very much older than her own 24. "How long have you had your ranch?" she asked. 5 years, he said. "I came out here in '73 with 3 horses and a borrowed set of cattle equipment and more confidence than sense. I have made it work, but it has required a considerable amount of patience and a willingness to be wrong and try again." He paused. "I have a man named Theo who helps with the cattle. He has been with me since the 2nd year. And there is a neighboring family, the Caputos, who have a homestead about 3 miles east. Good people. You have been managing the house alone." "I am not gifted at it," he admitted with such frank self-awareness that she found herself almost smiling. "The cooking is functional at best. The cleaning has been intermittent." "I see," she said. "I went to Calico Flats today for supplies, nothing else," he said. "I happened to walk past the gathering in the main street on my way back to the livery and stopped because I saw a woman standing on a platform looking like she was calculating exactly how much force it would take to break free of that situation. I could not walk past that." Delia considered this. "That is what I was calculating," she admitted. "I thought so." I had identified 2 possibilities. One involved the auctioneer's coat catching fire. The other involved the supporting post of the platform. Something that was unmistakably a laugh escaped George Stone before he seemed to fully anticipate it, and it transformed his face completely. The set jaw and the careful eyes suddenly replaced by something open and warm and younger looking. He recovered himself quickly, but the laugh had happened and could not be unhappened, and something between them shifted in a small but significant way. "You would have gotten yourself out," he said. "I believe I would have," Delia agreed. "Eventually, though I am not ungrateful for the more direct route." The ranch appeared as the sun was moving toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of copper and deep orange that made the desert landscape look like something painted by a very dramatic artist. It was not a large operation. A main house that was solidly built if not elegant, a barn, 2 corrals, a chicken coop, a root cellar, and several outbuildings that served various practical purposes. The house was made of adobe with a wide front porch, and it sat at the base of a low range of hills that broke the prevailing wind and gave the place a feeling of shelter. A man was at the corral fence when they pulled up. Theo, who turned out to be a lean, dark-skinned man of about 40 with a quiet manner and steady eyes who had been working cattle since he was a boy in Texas. He looked at Delia without apparent surprise and nodded to her in a way that was respectful and uncomplicated. "Theo," George said, climbing down from the wagon, "this is Miss Delia Hurst. She will be keeping house here. Miss Hurst, this is Theo Abernethy. He manages the cattle operations and is the most capable man I have ever worked alongside." "Miss Hurst," Theo said, touching the brim of his hat. "Mr. Abernethy," Delia said, "I am pleased to meet you." She was given the small bedroom off the kitchen, which was plainly but adequately furnished, with a good iron bed and a window that looked out toward the hills. George helped carry in the few things he had that might make it more comfortable: an extra blanket, a kerosene lamp, and then stood in the doorway of the room with a slight awkwardness that she found, for some reason, reassuring. "I will write out the terms of the arrangement tomorrow morning," he said. $20 monthly, room and board, Sundays free. If there is anything else you need, please say so. "I need some of my things back," she said. "Harlan Croft kept my trunk." Something moved behind George Stone's eyes. Was Croft headed after Calico Flats? "I do not know. Does it matter?" "It might," he said. "A man named Croft who moves women between towns is a man who goes back to the same roots. There are people in this territory who track such individuals." He paused. "I would like to try to recover your trunk if you will allow me to make inquiries." She looked at him. "You would do that? You said there are personal items in it. Your mother's comb." He had been listening very carefully, she realized. "Yes, I would do that." Delia Hurst, who had not cried since the moment she understood what was happening in that wagon 3 weeks ago, because crying had seemed like a luxury she could not afford, felt something press against the back of her throat that was very close to tears. She kept her face composed by main force of will. "Thank you," she said. "I would appreciate that very much." He nodded, said good night, and left her to the room and the lamp and the view of the desert hills through her small window. She sat on the edge of the iron bed for a long time that night, listening to the particular sounds of a desert night: the distant coyotes, the wind moving against the adobe walls, the small sounds of the house settling around her. Outside, the stars were extraordinary, the way stars are in places far from town lights, packed dense and brilliant across the whole sky. She thought about the morning and the platform and the long ride, and about a man who had pushed through a crowd to ask her name. She slept better than she had in 3 weeks. The next morning, Delia Hurst assessed the house. It was, as George Stone had suggested, in need of attention. The kitchen was functional but disorganized, with provisions stored without particular logic and several months of culinary imprecision visible in the state of the iron stove. The front room was sparsely furnished and dusty. The windows needed washing. There were curtains that had been made by someone, a woman, clearly, from the careful stitching, that had faded in the sun and wanted mending. She wondered briefly who had made those curtains, and filed the question away. By the time George and Theo came in from the morning's cattle work, Delia had the kitchen reorganized, the stove cleaned, coffee on the boil, biscuits in the oven, and had begun a list of items the house needed that she intended to discuss with George in a businesslike manner. She had also identified that the curtains in the front room could be refreshed with new dye if the right materials were obtained, which was the kind of practical, creative problem she found genuinely satisfying. George Stone stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the transformation with an expression of quiet astonishment that he tried, not entirely successfully, to contain. "It smells like coffee," he said, as though this were a remarkable thing. "It is coffee," Delia confirmed. "Sit down, Mr. Stone. I have a household list I need to go over with you." Theo, who had the wisdom of a man who has observed other people's domestic situations without involving himself in them, took his coffee and his biscuit and went back outside with a slight smile that he kept mostly hidden. George Stone sat down at the kitchen table and received the list that Delia placed in front of him. It was thorough and prioritized, and annotated with cost estimates, where she had enough information to provide them. He read it carefully, which she appreciated. Men who dismissed women's practical assessments without reading them were among the things she had least patience for. "This is very organized," he said. "I'm a very organized person," she replied. "The window in the back bedroom has a crack." He was looking at item 7 on the list. "I noticed it. It will get considerably worse once the winter cold sets in." He looked up from the list. "You know something about building maintenance." "I know something about cold coming through cracks," she said. "I spent a winter in a drafty room in Missouri when I was 14. I learned to notice structural vulnerabilities out of self-interest." A smile again, not the surprised laugh of yesterday, but a quieter, more thoughtful smile. "Miss Hurst, I believe you may be the most practical person I have ever employed." "Good," she said. "Pass me the sugar, please." The days that followed fell into a rhythm that suited them both, as routines do when they are built around people's actual natures rather than imposed upon them. Delia managed the house with the competence and inventiveness of someone who had always had to make do with limited resources, and had developed a genuine creativity within those constraints. She cooked well, simple food, hearty and good, and kept the house with a cleanliness that was functional rather than performative. She repaired what needed repairing, reorganized what wanted reorganizing, and gradually brought the place from a state of mere functionality to something warmer and more like a home. She also began learning the operations of the ranch, because she was curious, and because understanding the larger context of the place where she lived seemed useful. She asked Theo questions when he had time to answer them. About the cattle, about the grazing patterns, about the water sources and the seasonal challenges. Theo, who was plainly a man of considerable intelligence who had spent many years being underestimated, responded to her genuine interest with an increasing openness that eventually became something close to friendship. George Stone noticed her curiosity and encouraged it. In the evenings, after supper, he sometimes stayed at the kitchen table over a second cup of coffee, and they talked about the ranch, about the territory, about news that came through with travelers and the occasional newspaper from Reno or Carson City. He was not a talkative man by nature, but he was a good listener and an honest speaker, and Delia found that their conversations often surprised her by lasting much longer than she had anticipated. She learned things about him gradually, the way you learn things about people who are careful with themselves. He had grown up in Ohio, the middle child of a large family on a farm. He had come west at 23 after a fever had taken his young wife. They had been married only 8 months when she died, and he had gone west less to find something new than to get far enough away from the grief that it might become survivable. The curtains in the front room had been hers. Her name had been Clara, and she had been 21 years old when she died, and George Stone had carried that loss for 5 years in the particular way that quiet men carry loss, not on the outside where it could be seen, but deep inside where it had slowly become part of the structure of him. Delia learned this not from George directly but from a conversation with Theo, who told her matter-of-factly and without sentimentality, because he thought she ought to know, and because he had apparently decided that Delia Hurst was someone worth informing. "He is a good man," Theo said. They were at the corral fence, and Theo was checking the post repairs that George had made the previous day. "Decent through and through. Not many like that out here." "No," Delia agreed. "There are not." Theo looked at her sideways in the way he had just a brief look, precise and observant. "He talks more since you came," he said. Delia did not respond to that directly, but she thought about it. She thought about it that evening, watching George Stone read at the table by the lamp, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, his dark eyes moving slowly along the lines of a ranching almanac he consulted regularly. He was wearing his work clothes, canvas trousers, a collarless shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and his hair needed cutting, and there was a small scar at his left jaw from some old incident she had not asked about. He was not conventionally handsome in the way of men in magazine illustrations, but there was something in his face when he was at ease that she found increasingly difficult to look away from. She was also, she recognized with some private alarm, talking more than usual, and thinking more clearly, and sleeping better, and noticing things she had not noticed in years: the color of the desert at dawn, the particular quality of the cold desert air that smelled clean and mineral and ancient, the way Marshall the horse blew warm breath into his bucket on cold mornings. She told herself this was simply the result of improved circumstances. She had been under significant stress for 3 weeks, and now she was safe and employed and adequately fed, and naturally that produced a more acute awareness of the world around her. This was the explanation she used for several weeks, and it served its purpose well enough until it didn't. The day it stopped serving its purpose was in mid-November, about 6 weeks after she had arrived at the ranch, on a morning when a hard frost had laid a thin white skin over the desert floor, and the air was sharp and brilliant, and everything was very clear. She had walked out to the small kitchen garden before breakfast to assess what remained of the late-growing vegetables before the deep freezes came, and she had not heard George come up behind her, because he moved quietly even when he was not particularly trying to. And when she straightened up from her examination of the remaining carrots and turned around, she nearly walked directly into his chest. He caught her by both shoulders to steady her, a brief, reflexive gesture, and for a moment they were standing very close together in the cold morning air with his hands on her shoulders, and the frost sparkling on the ground around them, and the whole desert spread out behind him in the early light. He stepped back immediately, and she stepped back, and they stood at a proper distance, and Delia said something about the carrots and George said something about the fence on the north pasture, and they went about their morning entirely normally. But something had shifted between them with the permanence of a change in the landscape after an earthquake, and they both knew it, and neither of them mentioned it. They didn't mention it for 2 more weeks, during which time a number of interesting things happened. The first interesting thing was a letter that arrived from a lawman in the town of Pine Ridge, 60 miles to the east, informing George that a man matching the description of Harlan Croft had been arrested in connection with a series of fraudulent employment schemes across 3 counties. Included in the brief written communication was a notation that certain personal property had been recovered and could be claimed by its rightful owner. George read the letter aloud to Delia at breakfast and watched her face with something careful in his expression. "He was caught," she said. "He was caught. And my things. I believe we should ride to Pine Ridge," George said. They rode to Pine Ridge on a Saturday, taking Marshall and another horse named Biscuit who was stocky and good-tempered, and the 60-mile journey took them through country that was wild and beautiful in the stark way of the Nevada desert in November, all pale rock and dark scrub and enormous sky. They talked more on that ride than they had talked at any one time since she had arrived, about childhood, about what they had each wanted before life had redirected them, about books they had read and things they had seen, and the particular quality of loneliness that comes from being self-sufficient for too long. "Do you miss Ohio?" she asked, somewhere on the 2nd hour of the ride. George thought about it honestly, which she had come to recognize as his habit with questions he took seriously. "I miss the green," he said finally. "This land is beautiful, but it is a different kind of beautiful than I grew up with. Ohio is soft and green in the summer. This is harder, sharper." He paused. "I have come to love it, but it took time." "I grew up in Missouri," Delia said. "Also green, also with a softness to it." "Do you miss it?" she considered. "I miss what I thought it was going to be. The place itself. I think I left it behind long before I physically left." He looked at her, and the look contained a question he did not voice. "Mother died when I was 11, she said, "and my father left not long after. The place stopped being home then." She said it simply, without drama, the way you state a fact that has been a fact for so long that the rawness has been replaced by something more like landscape, just part of the terrain of your life that you navigate around. "I am sorry," George said, and as before it was simply true. "I made my own way," she said. I would not trade what I know about myself for easier circumstances. Though I would trade some of the harder parts of the route to get here. The auction platform, specifically that, yes. He was quiet for a moment, then carefully, "You are safe now, Delia." It was the first time he had used her given name. They both noticed it. She did not correct him or pretend not to notice, and he did not apologize or retreat from it. "I know," she said, and she meant it in a way that went somewhat beyond the literal statement. At Pine Ridge, they collected her trunk from the county sheriff's office, a modest but legitimate lawman named Gallagher who had a wall covered in wanted notices and a desk buried in paper. The trunk was intact. The silver comb was there. The Bible with the pressed flowers was there. The 3 unsent letters were there, still tied with a piece of string exactly as she had left them. She sat with the open trunk in the sheriff's anteroom and ran her fingers along the familiar objects inside it with a reverence that she did not try to hide. George stood nearby and did not intrude on the moment, which was one of the things she was learning about him. He had a very fine sense of when to be present and when to give space. She closed the trunk and stood up and found that her eyes were bright in a way they sometimes got when she was containing something significant. "Thank you," she said. "For pursuing this. You did not have to. You told me what was in it," he said. "Of course I pursued it." That night they stayed at the Pine Ridge boarding house, in separate rooms down a narrow corridor, and Delia lay awake listening to the creaking of the building and to the sound of the wind outside and thought very carefully and honestly about what was happening to her, because she was a person who preferred to be honest with herself even when it was inconvenient. She was falling in love with George Stone. She had been falling in love with him in a gradual, steady way for 6 weeks, the way the tide comes in, not all at once but continuously, each small advance building on the last, until the ground that had been dry was thoroughly covered. She was not entirely sure what to do about this information. She was his employee. She had come to his household under circumstances that were dramatic and strange, and she did not know with any certainty how he thought of her beyond the fact that he had treated her with consistent respect and taken the trouble to recover her trunk and called her by her given name on a desert road, when he thought it was simply a private observation between 2 people riding through a large landscape. She resolved, in the way that she resolved most things directly and practically, to pay close attention and not rush anything. The month of December came in cold and clear, with hard freezes at night and brilliant days that turned the desert into a landscape of iron and silver and deep blue sky. Delia spent the cold evenings by the stove reading or sewing, and George often sat across from her reading or writing in the ledger books he kept for the ranch's accounts. Theo, whose own small quarters were in a well-insulated room at the back of the barn, occasionally came in for evening coffee, and the 3 of them would talk about the ranch's plans for the coming spring, or about the news from town, or simply sit in the comfortable silence of people who have become accustomed to each other's company. One evening in the 2nd week of December, Delia found the ledger books on the kitchen table, and in George's absence, he had gone to check on the horses after a worrying sound from the barn. She glanced at the open page. The numbers told a story she had not fully understood until that moment. The ranch was doing well, but only just. 5 years of building from nothing had left George Stone with a viable operation but very little margin. He had been spending carefully on everything, and yet he had offered her $20 a month and Sundays free without any hesitation, when he could not reasonably afford to be generous. She closed the ledger when she heard his boots on the porch. "Is Marshall all right?" she asked when he came in, stomping cold from his feet. "Just the wind getting into the barn boards," he said. He was fine. He sat down heavily in his chair. He looked tired in a way that went beyond the day's physical work, the tired of a man carrying a great many things at once. "George," she said, and he looked up at her use of his name, attentive immediately. "I looked at your ledger. I should not have done so without asking, and I apologize for that. But I saw enough to understand that your finances are more constrained than I had realized." He did not look angry or embarrassed, which she had half expected. He just looked steady. "They are manageable," he said. "I am proposing a reduction in my wage," she said. $15 monthly rather than 20. You set the terms in Calico Flats specifically to give me control over the agreement, and I am choosing to adjust them. "I will not reduce your wage," he said immediately. "It is not your decision," she pointed out. "I am making the offer." He looked at her for a long moment. The lamp on the table between them cast warm light on his face, and outside the wind was moving against the house with a low, persistent voice. "Why would you do that?" he asked, and the question was genuine. He was not arguing. He was actually asking. She considered how to answer honestly. "Because I have been here 2 months and I am not merely an employee in this house anymore," she said. "I care about what happens here. I care about this ranch. And I care," she paused very briefly, just a half breath, just enough that he noticed. "I care about the people in it." The silence between them was different from previous silences. It had a weight to it, a contained quality like air before a storm. George Stone set down the coffee mug he had been holding and looked at her in the direct, careful way he had, the way that saw the person and not the surface. "Delia," he said quietly. "You do not have to say anything," she said. "I did not say it to require a response." "I want to say something," he said. He moved the coffee mug aside and folded his hands on the table and looked at them briefly before looking back at her. "I came back from losing Clara telling myself that I was done with loving anyone. Not out of bitterness, but I thought I had used up whatever it was in me that was capable of it. 5 years is a long time to be certain about something." He stopped. "And then you walked off that platform in Calico Flats and told a crowd of 30 men your name like it was the most important fact they were going to hear that day. And I have not been as certain about anything since." Delia Hurst, who was by her own frequent assessment a very practical and composed person, felt the composure shift in her the way ice shifts in a river in early spring, not breaking exactly, but becoming something different, something with more movement in it. "I told you my name because it was mine and you asked for it," she said, and her voice was steady, though only just. "You were the only one who asked." "I know," he said. "That is not a thing I will stop thinking about." "George," she said. "Yes." "Would you like to come sit beside me instead of across from me?" He moved his chair around the corner of the table and sat beside her, and they looked at each other at close range with the lamp between them and the winter wind outside, and the full, complicated, tender truth of the last 2 months spread out around them like the desert landscape that had been slowly revealing itself since that October morning in Calico Flats. He reached out and put his hand over hers on the table, which was so simple a gesture that its simplicity was the most significant thing about it. "I should tell you," she said, "that I have a great deal of opinions about most things, and I am not easy to manage, and I will always say what I think rather than what is convenient." "I know," he said, and he was smiling, "and I intend to keep my savings, my own money, regardless of any other arrangement." "Of course," he said, as though this were self-evident. "Good," she said. "Then I think we understand each other." "I think we have understood each other since the wagon ride from Calico Flats," he said. "I think the rest has just been time spent being sure." He raised her hand from the table and held it in both of his, and looked at her with something so open and unguarded in his face that it was almost startling. A man who had kept himself carefully closed for 5 years, carefully maintained, suddenly choosing not to do that anymore. "Are you sure now?" she asked. "Entirely," he said. December in Nevada had a particular kind of cold beauty to it, clear days with air that tasted of ice and high, thin clouds that turned every color at sunrise and sunset. Delia and George spent the weeks before Christmas in a state of happiness that was new to both of them in different ways. Not giddy happiness, though there was lightness in it, but a deep, steady happiness, the kind that is built from honesty rather than from excitement, and that therefore has real weight to it. They had not discussed marriage, both of them understanding instinctively that the kind of relationship they were building required solid foundation before it required ceremony, and that neither of them was the sort of person who needed rushing into anything. They talked more than ever, ranging widely across subjects that interested them both, and there was a particular pleasure in discovering that two people's minds can move together well like two horses in harness, finding a matching rhythm. They had a neighbor who became important to Delia during this period. Elena Caputo was 30 years old, the wife of Marco Caputo, who farmed 3 miles to the east, and she was a warm, energetic woman with 3 young children and an inexhaustible supply of both conversation and practical wisdom. She came over one morning in mid-December ostensibly to bring a jar of preserved apricots, but really, Delia suspected, to satisfy a considerable curiosity about the woman who had taken up residence at the Stone Ranch. Elena Caputo had brown eyes that missed nothing, and a directness of manner that Delia found immediately refreshing. She sat at the kitchen table with coffee and apricots and looked at Delia for about 30 seconds before saying, "I have been trying to get that man to find some happiness for 3 years, and he has resisted every attempt. What did you do?" "I argued with him about household ledgers," Delia said. Elena Caputo laughed so hard that her coffee came close to spilling. "Perfect," she said. "That is absolutely perfect." They were friends within the hour, in the way that two people of similar character and complementary temperament sometimes become friends, quickly and thoroughly, without much ceremony about it. Elena brought Delia into the small community of women in the area, a loose network of homesteaders' wives and ranchers' housekeepers who formed the social fabric of life out here, sharing information and resources and occasional company across the considerable distances of the Nevada desert. Through Elena, Delia also learned more about the injustices that were woven into the fabric of life in this territory. The treatment of the Chinese miners who worked the silver claims under conditions that would not have been applied to white workers. The dispossession of the Paiute people whose land this had been before the mining companies arrived. The precariousness of women's legal standing in a territory where the law was still being improvised day by day. These were not subjects that most people discussed in polite company. But Elena Caputo was not particularly interested in polite avoidance of real things, and neither was Delia. "You see it clearly," Elena said one afternoon, and it was half a question. "I have been on the wrong end of systems that do not concern themselves with people's dignity," Delia said. "It tends to improve one's vision." George, when she raised these subjects with him, listened with the same careful attention he brought to everything, and engaged with them with an honesty that included acknowledging where he himself benefited from arrangements that were unjust. "Theo is the best hand in this county, and he has been paid less for his work at other ranches than men who were inferior in every way," George said one evening, with a flatness in his voice that was a kind of quiet anger. "I pay him the same I would pay any man of his skill. It is the minimum of what is right, not a virtue to be proud of." Delia looked at him. "Most men would consider it a virtue to be proud of." "Most men are wrong about a great many things," George said. On Christmas Eve, Marco and Elena Caputo came to the ranch with their 3 children, and Theo joined them from his quarters, and they all had supper together around the extended kitchen table. Elena had brought tamales, which she made every Christmas from her mother's recipe from Sonora, and Delia had made a pie from dried apples and a cake that used the last of a precious quantity of good sugar. George produced a bottle of whiskey for the adults and a small jar of honey candy for the children, and Theo played the harmonica with a skill that surprised no one who knew him well. It was an ordinary evening, and it was a complete one, full and warm and alive with the particular pleasure of people who have chosen each other's company and are glad of the choice. Delia sat next to George at the table, and they were not demonstratively affectionate. Neither of them was given to public display, but his hand found hers under the table at one point and held it for the length of one of Theo's songs, and that was enough, more than enough. The new year came in with a brief snowstorm, unusual for the Nevada desert and therefore exciting. The children from the Caputo farm came over to see the snow, and Delia watched through the window as George pulled them on a makeshift sled with a rope while they screamed with happiness, and she thought that this was a thing she had not expected to see. George Stone being towed across a snowy yard by 3 small children laughing. She went outside. The snow was light and dry, powdering everything with white that caught the winter sun in small sparks. Miss Hurst called Marco Caputo's eldest, a 7-year-old named Benito who had attached himself to Delia with the particular devotion of a child who has identified someone interesting. "Come pull us." "Benito," Delia said, crouching to his level, "I have a better idea. Let us build a fort." The snow fort took an hour and required all available hands, including George and Marco, and eventually even Theo, who had come outside to watch and been immediately drafted. By the end of it, there was a substantial fortification with 2 towers and an entrance tunnel, and the children were ecstatic, and Delia was covered in snow from the moment Benito had decided that throwing snow was more interesting than building with it. She was brushing snow from her hair when George appeared beside her. He had a particular look on his face, warm and open and very direct. "There is something I have been wanting to ask you," he said. She straightened up and looked at him steadily, because she had learned to recognize when he was being serious about something important. "I am not a man who makes speeches," he said, "so I will ask you plainly. Delia Hurst, would you consider marrying me? Not because of any convention about our living arrangements or because of what anyone might think, but because I want to spend my days with you. I want to argue about household ledgers with you. I want to sit across from you at that table for the rest of my life. And I want to be the person who is here if anything ever comes near you the way Calico Flats came near you, for as long as I am breathing." The snow was still coming down, light as feathers, in the cold January air. The children were shouting somewhere behind the snow fort. The sky was white and soft, and the whole desert had been temporarily transformed into something gentle and forgiving. "That was a speech," Delia said. "A short one. And a good one," she said, and she meant it with her whole heart. "Yes, George, I will marry you." He took her hands in both of his, and she could feel the warmth of them even through the cold of the day, and he pressed his forehead briefly against hers in a gesture that was entirely his own, not a kiss, something quieter and more fundamental than a kiss, a meeting of 2 people at the most direct point. "Good," he said softly. "That is very good." From behind the snow fort, Benito Caputo's small head appeared at the top of the wall with the perfect timing of children everywhere. "Are you getting married?" he demanded. "Benito," Delia called back. "Yes, and if you do not stop spying on people, you will spend the next hour shoveling snow with a very small shovel." Benito disappeared back behind the fort. From behind it, after a moment, came the sound of Elena Caputo's laughter. They were married in March of 1879, when the desert began its slow return to color after the winter's gray, with the first desert wildflowers opening in pale yellow and purple along the base of the hills. The ceremony was performed by a traveling minister who came through the territory on a circuit, and who, upon meeting Delia, made the comment that he had rarely seen a bride so clearly comfortable in her own mind about what she was doing, which Delia took as the compliment it was intended to be. Elena and Marco Caputo were the witnesses, and Theo stood beside George as his best man, dressed in a clean dark coat he had borrowed from Marco, his quiet face wearing an expression of unmistakable satisfaction. Elena cried, which she did enthusiastically and without any self-consciousness, and little Benito presented Delia with a bunch of wildflowers he had picked from the hillside, presented with the gravity of a very serious diplomatic gift. The minister married them on the front porch of the ranch house, with the desert spread out before them and the hills behind, and the sky overhead enormous and blue, and full of the spring's first real warmth. George Stone said his vows with the same straightforward honesty with which he said everything, looking directly at Delia throughout. Delia said hers clearly and firmly, and with her eyes bright in the way they got when she was containing something large and warm. When the minister declared them married and George kissed her, there was a whoop from Benito Caputo that startled a nearby jackrabbit from its cover and sent it bolting across the yard, which made everyone laugh, which was perhaps the best possible note for a wedding to end on. That night, with the spring air coming through the open windows and the desert fragrant with the particular sweetness of the season's new growth, Delia lay awake in the room that was now fully hers, had been hers since January in every meaningful way, and listened to George's steady breathing beside her, and thought about a wooden platform in a dusty town, and a man's voice cutting through the noise with a single reasonable question. What is her name? Everything since then had flowed from that question. It had been the smallest possible beginning. A man asking a thing that everyone else had considered irrelevant. A woman answering with the only thing that was completely hers to offer. And now she was here, in a house in the Nevada desert with spring air on her face, with her mother's silver comb on the dressing table and her Bible on the nightstand, and the man who had asked for her name sleeping quietly beside her, and the future spread out ahead of them as wide and as full of possibility as the desert itself. She turned onto her side and looked at the shadowed profile of his sleeping face, the jaw she had memorized, the small scar, the way the tension of his waking hours settled out of his face when he slept, and he looked younger and more open, and very much like himself. She fell asleep with her hand resting lightly on his arm. Spring turned the desert extraordinary. Delia learned the ranch's seasons with the same attentive curiosity she brought to everything, and found that each one had its own beauty and its own specific demands. Spring was all new calves and frantic grass growth, and the constant negotiation with water sources as the snowmelt came down from the higher elevations. She learned to ride properly, beyond the basic competence she had arrived with, and George taught her with a patience that was entirely characteristic of him, never making her feel that she was learning slowly or getting it wrong, only helping her understand the adjustments that made it right. Theo had been given a raise that winter. George had worked out the numbers carefully and presented it to him directly, and Theo had accepted it with his usual quiet dignity, and then proceeded to work with exactly the same commitment he always had, because he was that kind of person. Delia and Alina Caputo continued their friendship with increasing depth and breadth. They had started what Alina called their Thursday discussions, which were ostensibly sewing circles but were in practice wide-ranging conversations that encompassed everything from the best way to extend a flour supply in winter to the latest news from the territorial legislature about water rights to what Alina was reading and what Delia was thinking, and every interesting subject in between. Other women from the area joined sometimes. The wife of the barber in the nearest small town, 12 miles away, and a Basque woman named Amara who had homesteaded with her husband and 2 brothers to the north, and who had a fierce intelligence and strong opinions about nearly everything. These gatherings were among the things Delia valued most about her life on the ranch. They were the antidote to the isolation that the land itself could impose, and they were a reminder that women were doing the essential intellectual and social work of building this community, just as surely as the men were doing the physical work of building its structures. By the summer of 1879, Delia had saved enough from her wages, which George still paid her, because she had insisted upon it and he had understood without needing. It explained that her financial independence was not a transaction, but a principle, to purchase 3 sheep from a farmer who was selling out his operation to move his family to California. The sheep were her own enterprise, separate from the cattle, and she managed them herself with a confident practicality that amused George and earned the respectful interest of Theo. "You are expanding," George said one evening, looking at her across the kitchen table with a warm amusement that had become one of her favorite expressions on his face. "I am building something of my own," she said, "which was always the plan. Your sheep are eating my fence posts." They are excellent judges of timber quality, she said. They are essentially providing structural assessments. He laughed the full, unguarded laugh that she still loved hearing, because it meant he was fully at ease. And after 5 years of keeping himself carefully contained, George Stone fully at ease was a gift she never took for granted. In the autumn of 1879, 1 year after Calico Flats, Delia told George she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen, over coffee, in the same direct and practical way she told him most things, and watched the information travel across his face through something brief and almost uncertain, which she recognized as the reflexive fear of a man who had lost someone before, and then threw it into something that was both deeper and clearer, a happiness that went all the way down. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her with a careful firmness that was everything she needed, and she felt his heart against her chest, running fast. "Are you well?" he asked, his voice against her hair. "I am very well," she said. "I am also nauseated every morning, which I understand is normal and temporary. Tell me what you need." "Dry biscuits in the morning, and for you to stop looking so worried," she said. "I am strong, George. I am not Clara." She had not often invoked his late wife's name, but she said it now with gentleness and without any competitive spirit, because she wanted him to hear it and not flinch from it. Clara had been real, and loved and lost, and there was room in a life for grief and new joy both. He held her a little tighter for a moment, and then let out a long breath that contained 5 years of careful maintenance finally setting itself down. "All right," he said. "Dry biscuits and less worrying." "Perfect," she said. The winter of 1879 passed with the warm solidity of a household that was building itself from the inside out. Delia's pregnancy was uncomplicated, her health good, her energy, once the early nausea passed, unchanged from its normal high level. She continued managing the house, reduced her riding by early spring as a reasonable concaution, and maintained her Thursday discussions with Alina and the other women right through to the end, because the conversations were important, and she saw no reason to absent herself from important things merely because she was expecting a child. Alina, who had been through the business 3 times, was a resource of matter-of-fact practical knowledge that Delia valued enormously, and Mrs. Hartwell, the wife of the barber in town who turned out to have previous experience as a midwife before her marriage, agreed to come to the ranch when the time came. George, for his part, channeled his concern into useful directions. He repaired and reinforced the house in small but significant ways, built a proper cradle that was beautiful in its simple craftsmanship, and took over more of the kitchen work as Delia's energy flagged in the final weeks, producing meals that were, by his own admission, considerably better than they had been in his solitary years. "You have improved," Delia told him after one particularly good supper. "I have had instruction," he said. "You have paid attention," she corrected. "That is different and more valuable." "You always give me too little credit," he said. "I give you precisely the right credit," she said. "Which is why you trust it when I do." He shook his head, and the expression on his face was one that she had learned to recognize and still felt in the center of her chest every time she saw it. A look of such complete and settled happiness that it seemed almost strange on the face of a man who had spent 5 years keeping himself carefully away from exactly this. Their son was born in May of 1880, on a morning when the desert was already deep into its spring color, the hills covered in wildflowers and the sky a piercing blue. He came into the world efficiently and loudly, as though he had plans and no intention of delaying them, and Mrs. Hartwell declared him a healthy, strong boy of approximately 8 pounds with excellent lungs and a perfectly round head. George held him in the kitchen doorway afterward, with the morning light coming in from outside and the sound of the desert all around, and the look on his face was one Delia knew she would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. A man being given back something he had not let himself know he was missing. They named him Samuel Arthur Stone, Samuel for the given name of George's father in Ohio, and Arthur for no particular reason except that it suited him when they tried it out. Benito Caputo, when he came to see the baby 3 days later, studied Samuel with the serious scrutiny of a 9-year-old expert and declared him a good size, and not as wrinkled as the last Caputo one had been, which made Alina throw her hands up in exasperation and made Delia and George laugh until they had to set the baby down. Samuel Arthur Stone proved to be a child of strong opinions from the very beginning. He slept when he chose and not when convention suggested, ate with great enthusiasm, and regarded the world with the wide, considering attention of someone who was collecting information as quickly as possible. Delia nursed him and talked to him and carried him in a sling she had made from a length of sturdy cloth, conducting her household activities with him along, explaining what she was doing and why in the same tone she used when she was simply thinking aloud. "You are teaching him already," George said one morning, watching her at the kitchen table with Samuel on her lap, showing him the pages of an almanac with a patient narration. "He is paying attention," she said. "It would be rude not to explain." George sat down across from them and looked at his wife and his son with the expression that had become the central image of his life, Delia, clear-eyed and capable and warm, speaking to their child as though he were already a full and interesting person, and Samuel regarding her with enormous dark eyes that were very like his father's. "I want to tell you something," George said. Delia looked up. "I know that you came here under circumstances that were terrible," he said. "That you were taken advantage of and put on that platform in Calico Flats, and that none of what led to that moment was anything you deserved or chose. And I want you to know that I am aware of that I do not take for granted that your path to here went through that. I am grateful that you are here. I am grateful every single day. But I need you to know that I am also angry on your behalf about everything that brought you to that town, and I want you to know that you are not required to be grateful for the part of it that was unjust." Delia looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "George," she said, "I have not been grateful for the injustice. I have been angry about it too, and I remain so, because it was wrong and it was done to other women besides me, who did not end up at a table with someone who asked their name. But I am deeply and genuinely grateful for you. Those are two separate things, and I hold them both." He reached across the table, and she took his hand, and Samuel, looking between them with his wide, considering gaze, reached out one small fist and grabbed George's thumb with the powerful grip of a baby who has identified something important and does not intend to let go. The years that settled into the Stone Ranch in the years following were good years, full and various and rich with the particular texture of a life built deliberately between two people who understood each other well. The ranch grew. George's cattle operation expanded in the year following Samuel's birth, helped by a good season and a successful arrangement with a buyer in Reno that gave them consistent income. Theo was promoted to a position that more accurately reflected his role, equal partner in the operations management, with a formal stake in the ranch's outcomes, which was something George had wanted to formalize for several years, and which Theo accepted with his characteristic quiet dignity. Delia's sheep herd had grown to 12 animals by 1881, and she had begun selling wool to a women's cooperative in Reno that processed it into cloth. It was a small income but a significant one her own, maintained with her own labor and judgment, which was the principle that mattered. She also began in that same year, contributing occasional articles to the Nevada Territory Messenger, a small newspaper based in a town 30 miles away whose editor, a dry, sharp-minded woman named Mrs. Forsyth, who had inherited the paper from her late husband and expanded it considerably, had read a letter Delia wrote to the editor about water rights and land use, and had written back asking for more. The articles were practical and precise and occasionally blunt, and they covered subjects that the male contributors to the paper did not generally address. The conditions of women who arrived in the territory without adequate support or legal protection, the need for better regulation of the labor arrangements that allowed men like Harlan, Croft to operate with impunity. The educational needs of children in remote homesteads who had no access to schools. They caused some discussion and occasional strong reaction, which Delia read with composure. George read each article when it was published and kept copies in the house with a quiet pride that he expressed mostly by telling other people about them when the subject came up, which Delia found both endearing and slightly mortifying. "You do not have to show people," she said. "You are a very good writer," he said. "Why would I not show people?" "Because it is boasting," she said. "It is fact," he said. "I am telling people a fact. That is different from boasting." "That is exactly the logic I use when I am technically right and also being annoying," she said, and he grinned with the unrestrained pleasure of being caught out. In the spring of 1882, when Samuel was nearly 2 years old and had developed a personality that combined his mother's directness with his father's careful observational attention in a way that was both illuminating and exhausting, Delia told George she was expecting again. This time, he received the news with a large and uncomplicated happiness that had none of the worry of the first time, because he had watched her be well and strong through one pregnancy already, and trusted what he had seen. "Do you have a preference?" she asked. "A healthy child and a well wife," he said immediately. "Everything else is additional." "An answer that requires no revision," she said approvingly. Their daughter was born in November of 1882, at the beginning of the cold season, arriving quietly and looking from the first moment like someone with a plan. They named her Margaret Clara Stone Margaret for Delia's mother, whose silver comb sat on the dressing table, and Clara for the woman George had loved and lost, because there was room enough in their life for all the people who had mattered and were gone. George held his daughter in the lamplight of the kitchen, with the winter wind outside and Samuel asleep in his small bed and Delia watching from the chair where she was resting, and the tenderness on his face was so complete and undefended that it made the air in the room feel different. "Hello, Margaret," he said softly to the bundle in his arms. "We have been expecting you." Samuel, who had been informed extensively about the imminent arrival of a sibling and had developed strong views about it, appeared in the kitchen doorway in his nightshirt at 2 in the morning to examine the situation and announced, after a brief and thorough assessment, "She is small." "She will get bigger," Delia said. "All right," Samuel said, apparently satisfied, and went back to bed with the pragmatism of a nearly 2-year-old who has gathered the essential information. The life that continued from that point onward was, in all the ways that matter, complete. It was not perfect, no life is, and it had its difficult seasons. A year when drought threatened the water supply and George and Theo worked themselves to exhaustion finding solutions. A winter when Samuel had a bad fever that kept them both awake for a week. The slow and sad passing of the Caputo family's eldest dog, who had been a fixture of their communal life for years. There were articles Delia wrote that got her threatening letters, and times when the injustices of the territory pressed in from all directions and the anger of it sat heavy. There were mornings when George woke with the old grief for Clara quiet but present, and Delia understood that grief for the dead does not require apology or competition with the living, and simply sat with him in those mornings until the day found its own light. But through all of it, the fundamental thing remained intact and growing. Two people who had found each other in the most extraordinary circumstances, who had told each other the truth from the beginning, who had built something together from a single question asked in a dust-blown street in a town neither of them would have chosen. What is her name? The answer to that question was woven into everything that followed, into the ranch that grew and prospered, into the children who were raised with the understanding that their names were their own, and their stories were their own to tell, into the articles in the newspaper and the Thursday discussions, and the friendship with Alina Caputo, and the quiet, solid loyalty of Theo Abernethy. It was in the silver comb on the dressing table, and the pressed flowers in the Bible, and the curtains in the front room that Delia had redyed a deep, warm gold in the spring of their first year together, transforming them from a remnant of grief into something new. One evening in the autumn of 1883, 5 years, very nearly to the week, from that October morning in Calico Flats, George and Delia sat on the front porch of the ranch house after supper, watching the sun go down behind the western hills. Samuel, 3 years old and endlessly energetic, was chasing something of great importance in the yard below them. Margaret, nearly a year old, was asleep inside. The desert was laying out all its evening colors, copper and rose and deep amber, and the air smelled of sage and the season's first cold. "I have been thinking," George said. He was quiet for a moment, watching the sunset. "About what?" Delia said. "About Calico Flats," he said. "About what I almost did not stop to see." She looked at him. "I was irritated that morning," he said. "My supply order at the general store had been wrong and I had to wait an hour for it to be corrected, and I was hot and impatient and I wanted to get back to the ranch. When I heard that crowd in the main street, I told myself I would walk past it." He paused. "And then I heard Jessup Webb describing a woman like she was livestock, and I could not make my feet keep moving." "And instead of keeping moving," Delia said, "you asked my name. It was the only thing I could think of that might remind everyone involved, including you, that there was a person standing on that platform," he said. "It worked," she said. "It was the thing that worked." He reached over and took her hand, and they sat that way while the sun completed its descent and the desert took on its twilight colors, and Samuel caught whatever he had been chasing and held it up triumphantly, a large beetle, as it turned out, which he examined with intense satisfaction, and then released with the magnanimous air of a scientist who has gathered sufficient data. "George," Delia said, after a comfortable silence. "I want you to know something," she said. "Something I do not say often enough, perhaps. Coming here, being here, is not something I accept or endure or appreciate in a measured, practical way." She paused, and the evening light was on her face, and she was looking out at the desert with an expression of such clear and settled peace that it was its own kind of declaration. "I love this place. I love this life. I love our children and our friends and the work we have built together, and I love you, not because you rescued me from Calico Flats, although I was glad of it, but because of every single morning since then. Because of every argument about household ledgers and every conversation at that kitchen table, and every time you have told me the truth, even when it was complicated. Because of how you are with Samuel and Margaret. Because of who you are, which is the same thing that day after day and year after year, and I trust it the way I trust the hills behind this house." George Stone, who was not a man who wept, had to clear his throat twice before he could answer. "Delia," he said very quietly. "Yes. Every single morning," he said. "For as many mornings as we get, that is exactly what I want." "Then we are in agreement," she said. "We generally are," he said, "when it matters." Samuel appeared at the foot of the porch steps, beetle apparently concluded as a topic of interest, and looked up at his parents with his father's dark eyes and his mother's straight-backed bearing. "Are you talking?" he asked. "We are," Delia confirmed. "Can I come up?" "Always," George said, and reached down to pull his son up onto the porch between them. The three of them sat together in the fading light, George with his arm around Delia and Samuel between them, looking out at the desert with the focused attention of a child who is absorbing the world at speed. And from inside the house came the small sounds of Margaret stirring from her nap. And outside the stars were beginning to show in the darkening eastern sky. And the desert was completely itself, vast and ancient and sharp-edged and beautiful. The same desert that had been there before any of them and would be there after. The same desert that a woman had moved through on an October morning in 1878, not knowing where she was going, and had arrived, without intending to, precisely where she needed to be. Delia Hurst, who had become Delia Stone, who had stood on a platform in a town she had never heard of and given her name to a crowd that did not care for it, and had heard one voice among many ask for it like it was a thing worth knowing. She sat on her porch in the Nevada evening and held her husband's hand and watched her son and listened for her daughter, and she was, in the deepest and most complete sense of the word, home. Not the home she had been carried to. Not the home she had been taken from. The home she had made from the ground up, from a single question and a long wagon ride and a kitchen table and a collection of seasons and a love that had built itself honestly, without hurry, from the only materials that last, truth and time, and the willingness to see the person standing in front of you and ask their name. Marshall, the bay horse, shifted in the barn below the hill. The stars expanded above the Nevada desert. The wind moved soft and cold off the hills, and the sage bent with it, and somewhere to the east a coyote made its long, thin call to the early night. Samuel Stone, 3 years old, leaned against his father's arm and said, "What does the coyote say?" "It says that it is evening," George said, "and it is time to be where you belong." Samuel considered this with the thoroughness he brought to all information. "Are we where we belong?" Delia looked at her husband over their son's head, and he looked back at her, and between them passed everything that had ever needed to be said. The whole story. The auction platform and the wagon ride and the kitchen table and the curtains and the ledger and the snow and the vows and the children and the years, and every morning of every ordinary, extraordinary day, compressed into a single look between two people who had told each other the truth from the beginning and had never stopped. "Yes," Delia said to her son, "we are exactly where we belong." And above the Nevada desert, the stars came out one by one, and the night settled in around the ranch like a blanket, and the Stone family sat on their porch in the last of the evening light, whole and well and home, and the world turned on as it always has, indifferent to most things, but somehow, in this particular corner of the desert, on this particular evening, seeming almost to notice that something good had been made from something terrible, and that the name at the center of it had been asked for and given, and had become the beginning of everything worth having.